The sky over New Terra was on fire. It wasn't the kind of fiery sunset you'd see on a peaceful evening. It was something much worse. Firestorms of flaming starships rained down from above as the Zalvanti, a savage alien race, invaded with their fleet. The huge dark ships tore through the clouds, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The Zalvanti were known for one thing: hunger. They didn't just conquer planets, they consumed them. The Zalvanti's hunger was a deep, insatiable need for more than just food. They craved the flesh of other species, and no one, not even the most advanced civilizations, had ever been able to stop them. Their last attack had wiped out entire systems, leaving no survivors, and now they were here, over New Terra, the last of humanity's surviving colonies. Captain Alara Monroe stood on the bridge of the SS Valor, watching the battle unfold on the massive display screen. Her heart raced as she studied the incoming Zalvanti ships. She knew what was at stake. If they didn't stop them here, New Terra, her home, her people, would be next. The calm face of her communications officer flickered on the screen. "Captain, Zalvanti fleet entering the atmosphere. We've tried hailing them, but no response. They're not here for diplomacy. Shields up. All hands. Prepare for battle." The words hit Alara like a punch to the gut. They had been waiting for this moment. But now that it was here, the reality of the situation sank in. The Zalvanti weren't interested in talking. They were here to wipe out humanity once and for all. Her thoughts raced. The Valor was one of Earth's strongest warships, but there were only a handful of ships left, and the Zalvanti fleet was enormous. Numbers and firepower were not on their side. The ship's defensive shields hummed to life, but Alara knew that wouldn't stop the Zalvanti for long. Their ships were massive, built to tear through the toughest defenses. Earth's military had spent years preparing for an attack like this, but nothing had prepared them for the horror of facing the Zalvanti. Still, Alara was a soldier. She wasn't about to give up. Turning to her crew, she issued a calm but firm order. "Prepare the cannons. We fight until we have nothing left." There was no fear in her voice, only determination. Her crew had trained for this. They had been prepared for the worst. But even as she spoke, she knew that the battle ahead would not be one they could win easily. The odds were overwhelming, but giving up was not an option. Alara looked out at the fiery sky. There was a feeling of finality in the air. This would be humanity's greatest test. A fight for survival against an enemy that had crushed every other species that dared to stand in their way. But she wasn't ready to accept defeat. She couldn't. The people of New Terra were counting on her. The future of humanity was on her shoulders. In the midst of the chaos, Alara's mind raced. How do we survive this? She thought. How do we stand against a foe so ruthless, so relentless? The Valor's engines roared to life as they made a desperate dash for the Zalvanti ships. Every instinct in her told her this would be the hardest battle of her life. But Captain Alara Monroe wasn't one to back down. Not now. Not when humanity's last hope lay in the balance. The war for New Terra had begun, and Alara would fight until her last breath to ensure humanity had a future. The Zalvanti were unlike anything humanity had ever faced before. They weren't just a race of conquerors. They were creatures driven by a hunger so intense, so deep, that it consumed them entirely. Their bodies were long and thin, stretched like malnourished skeletons, covered in tight gray skin. Their eyes were huge, 6 of them on each face, each one gleaming with an almost unnatural hunger. It was said that their need for sustenance was the very reason they had turned to conquering other worlds. They didn't just need food, they needed flesh. Human flesh, alien flesh, anything they could sink their teeth into. Their home planet had been ravaged by war, disease, and famine. With their population dwindling, the Zalvanti turned to other planets, attacking with overwhelming force, consuming everything in their path. They were relentless, unstoppable, and their hunger was never satisfied. The hunger wasn't just a physical need, it was a madness. As the Zalvanti dropped from their ships onto the surface of New Terra, the ground shook. Each dropship hit the earth like a meteor, sending tremors through the city. The Zalvanti landed, with precision, their feet cracking the pavement beneath them. They spread out quickly, moving toward the nearest buildings, tearing through structures with their sharp, clawed hands. The air was filled with the sound of metal and stone being ripped apart, buildings collapsing as if they were made of paper. The screams of civilians echoed through the city streets, but they had little chance to escape. Alara Monroe, standing aboard the SS Valor, watched it all unfold with a sinking feeling in her stomach. The defense systems had been activated, and her fleet of warships had already engaged the enemy in the sky. Explosions lit up the heavens as human ships fired their weapons at the Zalvanti ships. Railguns sent metal projectiles screaming into the air, and energy blasts lit up the night like fireworks. But even with the combined strength of all Earth's remaining warships, the Zalvanti were too powerful. They had technology older than Earth's, but it was built for war, and it was far more advanced in its own way. They were fierce, determined, and above all, they were numerous. For every ship the humans destroyed, more Zalvanti appeared, dropping from the sky, their hunger for conquest and flesh undeterred. Alara's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the destruction unfold, knowing her forces were losing ground. With every passing minute, Alara turned to her officers. "Get our ground troops ready. I'll lead them in," she ordered. She couldn't stand by while her people were being slaughtered. As captain of the Valor, it was her duty to lead the fight, even if it meant going down with her ship. Her crew was loyal, and they trusted her, but she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. They were outnumbered, they were outgunned, and every second they wasted could cost them precious lives. Her voice was steady as she spoke to her squad of Marines. "We're going in. We'll fight on the ground. If we can hold them off, we buy the civilians time to evacuate." Her words were firm, but even she couldn't ignore the fear in her heart. The Zalvanti had never been stopped, not by anyone, not by any race. Yet here they were, humanity's last hope for survival hanging in the balance. The ship's landing. Bay doors opened with a hiss, and Alara led the charge onto the planet's surface. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and the smell of burning metal stung her nose. They landed on the outskirts of the city, where the fighting was heaviest. Buildings were collapsing around them, and the sounds of destruction filled the air. The Zalvanti were everywhere, tearing through everything in their path. Alara's team moved quickly, weapons raised, engaging the enemy with precision. But even as they fought back with everything they had, Alara knew the truth. This battle wasn't just about stopping the Zalvanti, it was about survival. If they didn't stop the Zalvanti here and now, the entire planet would fall. The fate of New Terra and humanity rested on their shoulders. The Zalvanti were a force of nature, and they were hungry for more than just victory. They were hungry for humanity itself. The battle on New Terra raged on, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. The Zalvanti were relentless, their massive, twisted bodies crashing through the ruins of the city with terrifying speed. Alara Monroe and her squad of Marines fought, valiantly, but they were facing a force far beyond anything they had ever encountered. The Zalvanti's strength was overwhelming, their speed almost unnatural. They attacked with brutal precision, tearing through walls, smashing vehicles, and ripping soldiers apart with ease. Their long, clawed fingers slashed through metal like it was paper. and their 6 eyes gleamed with a hunger that seemed insatiable. It wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a fight against a predator with no mercy, and the odds were stacked heavily against humanity. Despite the chaos around them, Alara's determination didn't waver. She pushed forward, leading her team through the war-torn streets. Her Marines followed, their weapons firing non-stop as they fought back the Zalvanti wherever they could. Every blast sent a Zalvanti crashing to the ground, but they were like a tidal wave. More kept coming. The soldiers were skilled, but they were still just human, facing an enemy that seemed like a force of nature itself. Ilara's heart raced as she thought about her crew on the Valor. They were still engaged in fierce space battles above, but down here, on the ground, the situation was growing increasingly dire. She knew that their only chance for survival was to disrupt the Zalvanti's overwhelming assault. Ilara's mind worked fast as she strategized on the move. They needed a way to tip the scales, to break through the enemy's endless onslaught. In the distance, she could see one of the Zalvanti's larger ships descending toward the city, its enormous form blocking out the sun. It was massive, and Ilara realized that if they didn't stop it soon, the Zalvanti would use it to launch an even more devastating ground attack. Her heart sank. The ship was too well armed, too powerful to take head-on. But then, an idea sparked in her mind. The Valor was still orbiting above, and it had a weapon that could give them the edge they needed. A long-range cannon, designed for planetary bombardment, could break through the Zalvanti ship's defenses. However, to get that shot, the crew needed precise targeting data from the ground. Ilara turned to her communications officer. "Get a message to the Valor. We need targeting data to fire on that ship. Now." The officer nodded and quickly relayed the message. Moments later, the response came. "We've got a lock, Captain. We can fire when you give the signal." Ilara didn't hesitate. She knew this was their best shot. If they could destroy that ship, they could cripple the Zalvanti's ground forces. It was their only hope of turning the tide. As Ilara and her squad fought their way through the streets, they encountered a particularly brutal wave of Zalvanti. They fought fiercely, and Ilara was starting to feel the weight of the battle pressing on her. Her body was sore, her energy draining with every fight, but she couldn't stop. Her team depended on her, and New Terra depended on her. They were losing ground. Her squad was down to only a few men, their ammunition running low, and, still, the Zalvanti came. But Ilara didn't stop. She fought with everything she had, determination burning in her eyes. Finally, after what felt like hours, she reached the target zone, a crumbled building with a perfect line of sight to the descending Zalvanti ship. The Valor was waiting for the signal. Ilara took a deep breath, steadied her weapon, and shouted, "Fire!" The moment the words left her lips, the ground shook beneath her feet as the long-range cannon of the Valor fired. The sky above erupted in a brilliant flash of light, and the massive Zalvanti ship exploded in mid-air. The shockwave sent ripples through the city, knocking the remaining Zalvanti off their feet. For a moment, everything was silent. The battlefield paused, as if the universe itself held its breath. Ilara's heart raced as she looked around at the destruction. The Zalvanti's massive ship had been obliterated, and with it, a huge part of their offensive power had been crushed. The human forces on the ground let out a collective cheer. They were still standing. They had managed to take down one of the Zalvanti's most powerful weapons, but the battle wasn't over. Ilara knew that this victory was just a small step in the larger war. The Zalvanti were still on the planet, still hungry, and still determined to destroy everything in their path. But for the first time since the battle began, Ilara allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, humanity could hold its ground. Battle on New Terra escalated further, and Ilara felt the weight of every decision pressing on her. After the destruction of the Zalvanti flagship, humanity's forces had gained a brief respite, but the war was far from over. The Zalvanti were resilient, and their hunger for destruction was unmatched. They regrouped quickly, their ferocity growing even more intense. The ground shook as their forces reassembled, and Alara's squad, battered and low on ammunition, was already fighting tooth and nail to hold their position. But something about this enemy was different, unpredictable, almost savage in their thirst for flesh. They weren't like other invaders Alara had faced before. They didn't just fight to conquer, they fought to consume, and this made them a dangerous, relentless force. With the Zalvanti regrouping and pushing forward, Alara knew that any hope of survival depended on one thing: disrupting their command structure. Without leadership, the Zalvanti would lose their coordination, and humanity could take the fight back to them. The question was how. The enemy's leaders were powerful, and Alara's small squad was hardly enough to make a difference against an enemy this vast. But then, as the situation grew more desperate, a message came through her comms, cutting through the static of the battlefield. A voice, filled with urgency, said, "Captain Monroe, we've located their command center. We've got one shot to strike." It was a risk, a huge one. The Zalvanti had established their command post deep in the heart of the city, surrounded by dozens of soldiers. It would be a suicide mission for any normal unit to attempt. But Alara knew they had no choice. If they didn't take down the command center, the Zalvanti would continue to pour reinforcements into the city, and humanity's forces would be crushed under the weight of their hunger. She made a split-second decision. Prepare to move out. We hit them now, or we lose everything. The squad, though exhausted and battered, responded with a mix of grim determination and unquestioning loyalty. They had been through hell, but this mission had the potential to turn the tide. With no time to waste, they pushed forward, navigating through the ruins of the city. The streets were filled with chaos, burning vehicles, collapsing buildings, and the faint smell of smoke hanging heavy in the air. The Zalvanti forces seemed endless, but the soldiers pressed on, moving with urgency. They were about to attempt the impossible. As they neared the heart of the city, the fighting grew fiercer. The Zalvanti were everywhere, their monstrous figures, towering above the soldiers, tearing through buildings and advancing like a relentless wave. Alara's heart pounded in her chest. She knew that they had only one chance at this. If they didn't take out the command center now, it would be too late. Her team split up, moving in small groups to approach the target from multiple angles. The Zalvanti weren't just formidable warriors. They were predators, using their superior senses to hunt down anything that moved. But they had underestimated humanity's resourcefulness. Alara led the final charge herself, blasting her way through the Zalvanti with precision. Her pulse rifle cut through the air, each shot striking true. She felt the weight of each blast, but it didn't stop her. She couldn't afford to hesitate. As they closed in on the command center, the Zalvanti commander, an enormous creature, his body covered in jagged armor and his eyes burning with a sickening hunger, emerged from the shadows. He was an apex predator, towering over Alara and her squad. The battle raged between them, with Alara fighting with all her might, dodging the Zalvanti's powerful strikes and delivering blows of her own. It was a test of willpower, of pure survival. But Alara didn't back down. With a well-placed shot, she struck the creature in the chest, sending it crashing to the ground. But the battle wasn't over. The command center was just ahead, and they had to finish the mission. As Alara and her squad moved in, the last of the Zalvanti forces tried to hold them back, but they had lost their leadership. The enemy was disorganized, their movements erratic. It wasn't enough to stop the humans. With one final push, Alara and her squad reached the command center. planting explosives that would wipe out the Zalvanti's strategic advantage. The explosion ripped through the air, and the sound of the blast echoed across the city. It was a victory, but it was a fragile one. Alara knew that the battle was far from won. But in that moment, the enemy's grip on the planet had faltered. The Zalvanti were no longer a unified force. Their hunger for conquest had been interrupted. Humanity had struck a blow, and Alara could feel the glimmer of hope returning. But it wasn't over yet. There was still more to fight for. The war wasn't over. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Alara felt like humanity had a chance. The aftermath of the explosion was deafening, and for a moment, it felt like the world itself had held its breath. The command center was in ruins, crumbling under the force of the blast. Alara Monroe and her remaining squad members staggered, away from the wreckage, hearts pounding and adrenaline still coursing through their veins. The city around them was still in chaos, but there was a shift in the air, a glimmer of hope. With the destruction of the command center, the Zalvanti's coordination had been shattered, and their assault had been thrown into disarray. It was a victory, but one that came at a high price. Alara looked around at the wreckage of the city. Buildings, still smoldering, the bodies of her fallen comrades scattered across the ground, and the few remaining soldiers struggling to hold their ground. The fight was far from over. Despite the victory, the Zalvanti were still a formidable force. They were relentless, their hunger for destruction far from sated. Even though their leadership had been severed, their savage nature pushed them forward, adapting and fighting with a brutality that seemed almost instinctual. But humanity had shown them that they could be stopped. Alara's team had inflicted a serious blow, and now she had to make sure it counted. She knew that they couldn't afford to rest on their laurels. The Zalvanti would regroup, and they would come back with a vengeance. She had seen it before. This wasn't a war that would end easily. Her mind raced as she calculated their next move. The battle was now a war of attrition. Alara's squad was small, their ammunition running low, and their morale beginning to fray. They had no choice but to dig in and hold what ground they could. Alara's comms buzzed with messages from the Valor, the ship still in orbit above New Terra, its crew coordinating with the ground forces. They had a few more heavy weapons, but their supplies were dwindling, and reinforcements were nowhere in sight. She had to make a decision. The situation was becoming desperate, and Alara felt the crushing weight of leadership pressing down on her. She could feel her squad's fatigue. But there was no time for rest. They needed to find the next target, the next piece of the Zalvanti operation that could cripple their chances of victory. Through the haze of destruction, a new threat appeared on the horizon. Another Zalvanti warship, larger and more menacing than the first. It was descending toward the city, its massive form blocking out the sun. The enemy was preparing for a counterattack, and Alara knew they didn't have the resources to face it head-on. But as the warship's shadows loomed over the battlefield, an idea sparked in her mind. There was still one weapon they had, the Valor's remaining artillery and its powerful long-range missiles. If they could hit the warship before it landed, they might have a chance at neutralizing the Zalvanti's final push. Alara gave the order to move. Her squad, despite their exhaustion, followed her lead with unwavering loyalty. They moved swiftly, dodging debris and enemy fire as they navigated the war-torn streets. The closer they got to the target, the more intense the fire became. The Zalvanti were everywhere, their monstrous forms emerging from every corner, their shrieks echoing through the ruins. Alara's pulse rifle cracked through the air as she fired, each shot bringing down another of the enemy soldiers. Her squad did the same, a coordinated assault that pushed them toward their objective. As they reached the open field where the warship was preparing to land, Alara and her team set up their final stand. They had one shot, and it had to count. The Valor was in position, its long-range missiles locked onto the Zalvanti ship. Alara knew they would have to act fast. The warship's engines were already firing, and it was only moments away from touching down. The Zalvanti forces were closing in from every side, and the air was thick with tension. Alara's heart raced as she gave the signal to fire. The ground shook as the missiles launched from the Valor, cutting through the atmosphere at breakneck speed. Alara held her breath, watching the trajectory, praying that they would hit their target. The warship fired back, unleashing a volley of destructive fire at her squad, but they couldn't stop what was coming. The missiles struck the Zalvanti ship with pinpoint accuracy, and the warship exploded in a flash of blinding light. The shockwave sent Alara and her team sprawling to the ground, but the victory was undeniable. The Zalvanti had lost their heavy weapon, their final chance to reclaim control of the battlefield. The explosion sent a ripple of silence through the battlefield. The Zalvanti forces, disoriented and leaderless, began to fall apart. It wasn't a total victory, but it was a turning point. Alara knew that humanity had just delivered a crushing blow to the invaders. The war was far from over, but the resilience of her squad and the relentless drive of the human spirit had proven something that the Zalvanti had underestimated. Humanity was not so easily defeated. Even in the face of impossible odds, they had found a way to strike back. The final stages of the battle for New Terra were nothing short of a whirlwind of chaos and hope. With the destruction of the Zalvanti warship and their shattered command center, Alara Monroe and her squad had finally delivered the kind of blow that could change the course of the war. The Zalvanti forces, now leaderless and disorganized, had lost their cohesion, their once unstoppable advance faltering. However, this was not the end. The victory, while significant, had come at an enormous cost. The city lay in ruins, the once thriving landscape now reduced to ashes and rubble. The human forces were weary, stretched thin, and running on little more than determination. The battle for New Terra had proven to be one of the most brutal and costly encounters humanity had ever faced. Alara knew that they couldn't afford to relax just yet. The Zalvanti were relentless, and even without a command structure, their primal instincts as conquerors and predators would keep them fighting. It was clear to her that they would not retreat quietly into the shadows. Despite the victory in the field, the war was far from over. The Zalvanti would regroup, reorganize, and return with a vengeance. The fight was no longer just about the land. It was about survival. As she moved through the city, surveying the damage and the remnants of her team, Alara saw that the true cost of the battle was not just in the ruins around her, but in the faces of those who had survived. The determination was still there, but the fear was, too. Fear of the unknown. Fear of the enemy's return, and most of all, fear that they might not be able to hold the line once more. Amidst the destruction, the survivors had found something unexpected, a moment of peace. With the Zalvanti forces scattered and their leadership in disarray, the humans had a brief window of respite. Alara seized the moment, gathering the remaining forces and rallying them for what would come next. She knew this was their best chance to strike decisively. With the support of the Valor and the remaining human ships in orbit, they could deliver a final blow to the Zalvanti forces, cutting them off before they had a chance to regroup. The next few days would be crucial. There was no room for hesitation. Alara and her team set to work, organizing strikes against any remaining Zalvanti strongholds, pushing them out of key positions. It was in those days that humanity's true strength became evident. Despite the chaos and the overwhelming odds, the survivors fought with a renewed vigor, knowing that the future of their planet depended on the decisions they made now. The human spirit, unbroken and unwavering, shone through in every mission, in every fight, and in every step they took to reclaim their world. Alara, exhausted but resolute, found herself drawing strength from the very people who had stood by her through the worst of the battle. She saw the same drive in their eyes, the same fierce determination to protect what they had built, to defend their homes, and to ensure that the Zalvanti would never again threaten their world. In the final confrontation, as humanity's forces closed in on the last remnants of the Zalvanti, the battle became one of attrition. It wasn't about grand space battles or overwhelming firepower. It was about holding the line, using every weapon at their disposal, and never backing down. Alara, with her squad at her side, led the charge, pushing into the heart of the Zalvanti stronghold. The enemy was desperate, fighting with every ounce of their strength, but they were no match for the sheer will and determination of the humans. With one final decisive assault, the last of the Zalvanti forces were routed, and the planet was finally free. The war was over, but it had come at a price. Humanity had fought not just for survival, but for the right to continue to live on their terms. The Zalvanti, despite their strength and hunger for conquest, had underestimated the power of human ingenuity and resilience. It was a victory forged in the fires of battle, one that would echo through history as a testament to the strength of humanity. Alara Monroe, standing amidst the ruins of New Terra, couldn't help but feel a bittersweet pride. They had won, but the cost had been high. As she looked to the future, she knew there was still much work to be done. But humanity had proven something important. They were not easily defeated. They were not just survivors. They were fighters. And they would never stop fighting for their future.